The emergency room doors at Phoenix Memorial Hospital burst open at 9:47 p.m. when Victor Frost Callahan carried his daughter Emma through the entrance, her 17-year-old body limp in his arms, blood soaking through the blanket he'd wrapped around her after finding her dumped in the parking lot of his clubhouse. Dr. Catherine Callahan looked up from the patient chart she was reviewing and felt her entire world invert when she recognized the broken girl in her ex-husband's arms as their only child, the daughter they'd raised together before the motorcycle club had torn their marriage apart 8 years ago. "Oh, God, Emma," Catherine breathed, her ER physician training taking over even as her mother's heart shattered. "Trauma Bay 3, now! I need ortho, I need neuro, I need every available surgeon in this building." Emma had been missing for 19 hours, taken from the parking lot of her high school at 2:30 p.m. the previous day by men in a white van that multiple students had witnessed, but no one had been able to stop. The first ransom call had come at 4:15 p.m. with demands for $500,000 and Victor's agreement to cease all Hell's Angels operations in Phoenix territory. Victor had been preparing to pay, had been liquidating assets and calling in favors, when Emma had simply appeared at the clubhouse parking lot at 9:30 p.m., dumped from a vehicle that sped away before anyone could get a license plate. She'd been conscious enough to whisper "Dad" before passing out, her body bearing injuries that made Victor's stomach turn even after 26 years of witnessing violence in the motorcycle world. Catherine worked with clinical precision that masked the terror consuming her, her hands steady as she cut away Emma's blood-soaked clothing and cataloged injuries that went far beyond what random cartel enforcers would inflict. 3 fingers on Emma's left hand had been surgically amputated, the cuts clean and precise with sutures already in place. Her right femur had been deliberately fractured in 2 places, the breaks showing evidence of surgical instruments rather than blunt force trauma. Burn marks in perfect circles dotted her torso, each one exactly 2.5 centimeters in diameter, suggesting medical cauterization tools rather than cigarettes or lighters. "This wasn't torture," Catherine said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to maintain professional detachment. "This was systematic dismemberment by someone with surgical training, someone who knew exactly how to maximize pain and permanent damage while keeping her alive. If you're ready to witness how a father's grief transformed into the most chilling investigation the Southwest has ever seen, how the torture of an innocent girl exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of the justice system, and how the price the perpetrators paid wasn't death but something far more terrifying, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will take you into the darkest corners of medical ethics, judicial corruption, and the terrible creativity of revenge that goes beyond simple killing into realms that will haunt everyone involved forever." Victor stood in the observation area above the operating theater watching a team of surgeons work to repair what could be repaired of his daughter's body, his face completely expressionless in the way that terrified people who knew him well enough to recognize it. Rachel "Red" Martinez found him there 2 hours into the surgery, the vice president's weathered face showing the controlled fury of someone who'd seen too much suffering in her 44 years. Red had lost her own daughter Melissa to a fentanyl overdose at 19, had spent the last 3 years since that loss channeling her grief into protecting the club's families and ensuring no one else had to bury a child. "Brother, we found the van that dumped Emma, burned out, wiped clean, but Tyler pulled surveillance from 3 cameras along its route. Vehicle was registered to a shell company that traces back to Cartel del Hielo Negro. The Black Ice Cartel had been expanding into Phoenix territory for 18 months, their operations characterized by unusual sophistication and connections that suggested backing from someone with resources beyond typical drug trafficking organizations. Their name came from their signature method of body disposal, victims found frozen solid in industrial freezers, preserved with such care that medical examiners could determine exact cause of death months after the fact. The symbolism was deliberate. Black ice victims didn't disappear into unmarked graves or dissolve in acid. They were kept, cataloged, displayed as warnings to anyone who might interfere with cartel operations. "They took my daughter," Victor said quietly, his voice carrying less emotion than a weather report but conveying threat that made Red's combat-honed instincts flare warning. "They tortured her with surgical precision. They sent her back broken in ways that will affect her entire life. I want everyone involved, every person who touched her, every person who gave orders, every person who knew and did nothing. And Red, I want them to understand that death would have been mercy compared to what's coming." Agent Thomas Reeves sat in his FBI office reviewing the Emma Callahan case file with growing unease that his 30 years of experience told him was justified. The kidnapping had been reported immediately, but the Phoenix office's response had been oddly delayed. Initial reports had taken 4 hours to process. The Amber Alert had been held for verification for 6 hours, and the kidnapping task force had only been activated after Emma had already been returned. Someone with authority had deliberately slowed the federal response, creating a window where the kidnappers could operate without interference. Reeves was 6 months from retirement, close enough that most agents in his position would have ignored the irregularities and let someone else deal with the complications. But his daughter was 15, exactly Emma's age, and he couldn't look at his own child without seeing Emma Callahan's tortured body and asking himself what he'd want someone to do if their positions were reversed. The surgical nature of Emma's injuries haunted Reeves because it suggested premeditation and expertise that went beyond typical cartel violence. He'd spent 15 years investigating organized crime, had seen what cartels did to victims, and while their methods were brutal, they were rarely surgical. This felt different, calculated, almost experimental, like someone had used Emma as a test subject to see what the Angel's response would be to specific types of injury. He pulled up medical examiner reports from other Black Ice cartel cases and found the same pattern: injuries that showed medical training, precision that suggested surgical instruments, victims who'd been kept alive far longer than necessary if the goal was simple execution. Someone with medical expertise was either part of the cartel or working closely with them, someone who understood human anatomy well enough to maximize suffering while preventing death. Dr. Helena Vance reviewed the surgical notes from Emma Callahan's emergency treatment with professional interest that her colleagues would have found disturbing if they'd known her true relationship to the case. Helena was 46 years old, one of Phoenix's most respected plastic surgeons, known for reconstructive work that gave burn victims and accident survivors their lives back. She was also the Black Ice cartel's primary money launderer, running millions of dollars through her legitimate practice while using her medical expertise to provide services that cartels typically had to seek from veterinarians or corrupt doctors in Mexico. The Emma Callahan case had been her idea, pitched to Judge Raymond Blackwood as an experiment to test whether the Angels could be controlled through targeted violence against family members rather than direct confrontation with the club itself. Emma's torture had been methodical and documented. Helena had personally performed the finger amputations using proper surgical technique, had fractured the femur with orthopedic tools designed for controlled breaks, had applied cauterization in patterns that would test the girl's pain tolerance while creating permanent scarring. The goal hadn't been to kill Emma but to transform her, to send Victor Callahan a message that his daughter would live but would never be whole again, that every time he looked at her he'd see evidence of his failure to protect her. Helena had expected rage, expected the Angels to retaliate violently against the cartel in ways that would justify federal crackdowns Judge Blackwood had been preparing. What she hadn't expected was the complete silence from the Angels in the 24 hours since Emma's return, an ominous quiet that suggested Victor was thinking rather than simply reacting. Scott Bishop Williams sat in his apartment staring at his phone, at the video that had arrived 3 months ago showing his younger brother Tom being waterboarded by Black Ice enforcers, while a calm voice explained exactly what Scott needed to do to keep Tom alive. The instructions had been simple: provide information about Victor's family, about Emma's schedule and movements, about security gaps that could be exploited. Scott had resisted for 3 weeks, had tried to find Tom through his own investigations, had gone to other angels for help. Then the second video had arrived showing Tom with 2 broken hands and missing teeth, and Scott's resistance had crumbled. He'd given them Emma's school schedule, her route home, the times when she was most vulnerable. He'd enabled his president's daughter to be kidnapped and tortured, had betrayed everything the club stood for, because the alternative was watching his brother die by inches in cartel custody. The guilt was consuming Scott from inside, making it impossible to eat or sleep or look Victor in the eye during the emergency church meeting that had been called 20 hours after Emma's return. He'd sat in that meeting, listening to theories about how the cartel had known Emma's movements, watching Tyler demonstrate how they'd traced the van's route, hearing plans for retaliation that would inevitably trace back to Scott's betrayal. He wanted to confess, wanted to throw himself on the club's mercy and accept whatever punishment they decided. But confessing meant Tom's immediate execution, meant his brother's death would be for nothing, meant choosing between 2 impossible options that both led to destruction. So Scott stayed silent, kept his guilt locked behind careful expressions, and waited for the inevitable moment when Tyler's hacking or Red's investigation would uncover the truth. Tyler Ghost Park sat in the clubhouse basement surrounded by 6 monitors displaying code, surveillance footage, financial records, and encrypted communications he'd been systematically cracking for 36 hours straight. The 21-year-old prospect had earned his road name 2 years ago when he'd accidentally hacked into a rival cartel's systems while testing penetration software, discovered they were planning to kidnap his younger sister, and had systematically destroyed their entire digital infrastructure in retaliation, wiping bank accounts, exposing member identities to law enforcement, and creating such comprehensive chaos that the cartel had collapsed within weeks. The Angels had recruited him immediately, recognizing that warfare in the 21st century required keyboards as much as firearms. What Tyler had discovered about Emma's kidnapping went far beyond simple cartel operations. The shell company that owned the van traced to a medical supply corporation, which connected to 3 plastic surgery clinics in Phoenix, all owned by Dr. Helena Vance. Financial records showed regular payments from these clinics to offshore accounts that connected to Black Ice Cartel money laundering networks. But more disturbing were the medical supply orders. Surgical instruments, anesthetics, and specialized trauma equipment being delivered to locations that had no legitimate medical facilities. "Victor, you need to see this," Tyler said, his voice tight with the controlled excitement of someone who'd found something huge. Emma wasn't tortured by cartel enforcers. She was operated on by a surgeon, a very skilled surgeon who had access to hospital-grade equipment and knew exactly what she was doing. Victor studied the evidence Tyler had compiled with the methodical focus that had made him chapter president, his mind connecting dots that painted a picture more disturbing than random cartel violence. "You're saying a doctor tortured my daughter? A legitimate physician performed surgical procedures designed to cause permanent damage?" Tyler nodded, pulling up Dr. Helena Vance's medical license and professional credentials. Dr. Vance is one of Phoenix's top reconstructive surgeons. She's won awards for her burn victim work, has published papers in major medical journals, sits on hospital ethics boards. She's also laundering approximately $40 million annually for Black Ice Cartel through her clinics. And Victor, the surgical technique used on Emma Match's procedures Dr. Vance pioneered for battlefield trauma reconstruction. The finger amputations, the controlled fractures, even the burn pattern, it's all from her published research. The revelation transformed Victor's understanding of what had happened to his daughter from random cartel violence into something far more calculated and personal. This wasn't about drugs or territory or typical criminal conflicts. This was an experiment, a test to see how the Angels would respond to surgical torture of a family member, performed by someone with medical expertise who'd deliberately chosen to weaponize her skills. "Find her," Victor said quietly. "Find every location she uses, every person she works with, every connection to Black Ice Cartel. And Tyler, I need you to access her medical records, her research notes, anything that might tell us why a doctor would do this to a 17-year-old girl. Rachel Red Martinez had been running her own investigation in parallel, using contacts from her Marine Corps days to trace Black Ice Cartel's unusually sophisticated operations back to their source. What she'd discovered suggested corruption that went beyond typical cartel law enforcement cooperation into something more systemic and protected. "Victor, we need to talk somewhere private," Red said, gesturing toward the soundproof room the club used for sensitive discussions. Once inside, she spread out surveillance photos showing Dr. Helena Vance meeting with a man Red identified as Judge Raymond Blackwood, federal judge for the District of Arizona. These meetings have been happening monthly for 18 months. Blackwood presides over most of the cartel cases in Arizona. His conviction rate for Black Ice members is 12% compared to 87% for other cartels. Every case involving Black Ice collapses due to evidence issues, witness problems, or prosecutorial errors that all trace back to decisions Blackwood makes from the bench. The implications were staggering, a federal judge coordinating with a cartel through a surgeon who laundered money and apparently provided specialized torture services. This wasn't simple corruption. This was infrastructure, a network that had been built over years to protect Black Ice operations while using the justice system as a weapon against their enemies. Emma's torture wasn't just about hurting her, Red continued, her voice carrying the analytical precision of someone trained to assess complex battlefield situations. It was about creating evidence of cartel violence that would justify federal intervention against us. Blackwood has been preparing a RICO case against the club for 6 months. If we'd retaliated immediately against Black Ice, if we'd started a war, he'd have had the justification he needed to arrest our entire leadership structure. Emma was bait, Victor. Your daughter was tortured to trigger a response that would let Blackwood destroy the club legally. Victor felt cold fury settling into his bones, the kind of rage that didn't explode but instead crystallized into absolute determination. They'd used his daughter as a tool, had calculated that a father's love could be weaponized to destroy an organization, had inflicted permanent damage on a 17-year-old girl as part of a strategy to consolidate judicial and criminal power. "We need Agent Reeves," Victor said finally. "If Blackwood is corrupt, FBI needs to know, but we approach this carefully. If Blackwood gets spooked, he'll destroy evidence and disappear into federal protection programs. We need to trap him in a way he can't escape." Agent Thomas Reeves met Victor and Red in a parking lot 30 miles outside Phoenix, his presence at this meeting a violation of multiple FBI protocols that could end his career if discovered. But Reeves had been reviewing Judge Blackwood's case history for 48 hours and had found patterns that made his investigators' instincts scream warnings. Evidence that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who recanted or vanished, prosecutorial decisions that seemed designed to create appealable errors. If Blackwood is dirty, it explains why the FBI response to Emma's kidnapping was delayed, Reeves said, studying the evidence Tyler had compiled. Blackwood has friends in the Phoenix office, people who owe their careers to his recommendations. He could have made calls, created just enough bureaucratic friction to give the kidnappers their window. Red handed Reeves additional documentation showing financial connections between Blackwood's offshore accounts and Dr. Vance's money laundering networks. Judge has been taking 15% of everything Vance launders. That's approximately $6 million annually that Blackwood receives through intermediary corporations that he thinks are untraceable. Tyler traced them in 48 hours because Blackwood used the same financial architect that Victor Bout used before his arrest in 2008. The patterns are identical, and once you know what to look for, it's obvious. Reeves felt his stomach sink as he recognized the names of the shell corporations. He'd seen them before in other investigations that had mysteriously stalled or been reassigned. Blackwood's corruption wasn't isolated. It was part of a system that had infected multiple cases over years, perverting justice while hiding behind judicial immunity that made judges nearly impossible to prosecute. "I can't officially investigate a federal judge without approval from Washington," Reeves said, his frustration evident. "The process takes months, requires mountains of evidence, and Blackwood would be alerted through official channels before any arrest could be made. But if I happened to receive information from a confidential informant, information that I could verify through independent investigation, that might create a path forward. He looked at Victor directly. I'm not asking you to be that informant officially. I'm not offering any deals or protection. But if evidence appeared that connected Blackwood to Emma's torture, evidence that was obtained legally and could be verified, I would have grounds to approach the Attorney General directly and request emergency authorization to investigate judicial corruption. Victor understood what Reeves was offering, a narrow path where the Angels could investigate outside legal constraints, but anything they discovered would need to be verified through legitimate means before it could be used. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but might be the only way to expose Blackwood without triggering the federal protection systems that would shield him. We'll get you evidence, Victor said. But, Agent Reeves, you need to understand something. My daughter will never be whole again. She's lost 3 fingers permanently. Her femur was shattered badly enough that she'll walk with a limp for the rest of her life. She has burn scars that will require years of reconstructive surgery. The people who did this to her, they need to face consequences that matter. Prison isn't enough. I need them to understand what they took from Emma, to feel it in ways that haunt them forever. Reeves met Victor's eyes and recognized the promise of violence that no legal system could satisfy. The law can only do what the law can do. What happens outside the law, I can't control or condone. But I can tell you that sometimes the worst punishment isn't death or prison. It's living with the consequences of what you've done, having to face yourself every day knowing what you're capable of. Whatever you're planning, Victor, make sure it serves justice and not just revenge. Make sure Emma can live with what her father becomes in the process of avenging her. Scott Bishop Williams received the text message at 3:47 a.m. 3 simple words that destroyed any remaining hope that he might escape consequences. We know. Tomorrow. No signature, no explanation needed. Someone in the club had discovered his betrayal, and tomorrow he would face whatever justice the Angels decided to dispense. Scott thought about running, about taking his wife and disappearing into whatever life existed for ex-bikers who'd betrayed their brothers. But running meant abandoning Tom, meant his brother would die because Scott had been too cowardly to face consequences. He sat at his kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. One to his wife explaining everything and asking her forgiveness. One to Victor, accepting full responsibility for Emma's torture and begging for Tom's life to be spared even if Scott's couldn't be. At 6 a.m., Scott walked into the clubhouse and found Victor, Red, Tyler, and 8 other senior members waiting. The room felt like a courtroom, formal and final, and Scott understood that there would be no appeals from whatever verdict was rendered. I gave them Emma's schedule, Scott said before anyone could speak, his voice steady despite the terror consuming him. Black Ice has my brother Tom. They've had him for 3 months. They sent videos of them torturing him. They said they'd kill him if I didn't cooperate. I'm not asking for mercy for myself. I know what I did is unforgivable. I'm asking that Tom not be punished for my betrayal, that someone tries to find him before Black Ice kills him as retaliation for my confession. The silence that followed Scott's confession was absolute, 20 seconds of perfect quiet where everyone processed the revelation that their road captain had enabled the torture of their president's daughter. Red spoke first, her voice carrying Marine Corps authority. Bishop, you've been my friend for 12 years. You stood beside me when Melissa died. You helped me bury my daughter and didn't judge when I couldn't stop drinking for 3 months after. That friendship is why I'm going to say this directly instead of letting Victor do it. You betrayed us in the worst possible way. You gave them Emma, a 17-year-old girl who never wore a patch, never took an oath, whose only crime was being born to a Hell's Angel. And you did it to save your brother, which I understand but doesn't change what you did. Victor stood and approached Scott slowly, his weathered face showing not rage but something colder and more permanent. Bishop, I've known you for 16 years. You were there when Catherine left me. You were there when Emma was born. You taught her how to ride a bicycle when she was 6 years old. And you gave her to people who cut off her fingers and broke her bones and burned her skin for their experiment in psychological warfare. He paused, letting the words settle. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to help us find your brother Tom. You're going to wear a wire and meet with whoever you've been communicating with in Black Ice. You're going to help us trap Blackwood and Vance and everyone involved in Emma's torture. And when that's done, when we've destroyed everyone responsible, you're going to leave Phoenix and never come back. You're out bad, Bishop. You betrayed your club, but we're going to let you live because Tom doesn't deserve to die for your choices and because your wife doesn't deserve to bury a husband who died as a traitor. Scott felt tears streaming down his face. The mercy of being allowed to live somehow worse than execution would have been because it meant carrying the guilt forever, meant knowing that every day he breathed was a gift he didn't deserve. Thank you, he whispered, the words inadequate but all he had. I'll do whatever you need. And Victor, I know this doesn't matter now, but I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. Victor turned away without responding, and that silence was more devastating than any words could have been. Miguel El Frio Castillo sat in his kitchen at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, unable to stop seeing Emma Callahan's face when Dr. Vance had been performing the surgical torture that Miguel had been forced to witness as punishment for an earlier moment of perceived disloyalty to the cartel. Miguel was 41 years old, had worked for Black Ice for 8 years, and had done terrible things in service to an organization that paid well but demanded absolute obedience. He'd accepted that violence was part of the life he'd chosen, had made peace with being an enforcer who hurt people for money. But watching a surgeon systematically mutilate a 17-year-old girl while that girl begged for her father had broken something in Miguel that he hadn't known could break. His wife Maria had been awake when he'd come home that night, had seen something in his face that made her abandon the careful pretense that Miguel's security work was legitimate employment. What happened? She'd asked quietly. And Miguel had told her everything, about Emma, about the torture, about Dr. Vance's clinical detachment as she removed fingers and fractured bones, about Judge Blackwood's orders that the girl needed to survive but never be whole again. Maria had cried, had held their 2 children sleeping in the next room, and had said something that Miguel couldn't stop thinking about. We have a daughter, Miguel. Gabriela is 14. If someone did to our baby what you watched happen to that girl, what would you want from the person who witnessed it? What would you want him to do? Miguel had been thinking about Maria's question for 48 hours, and the answer had become clear even though acting on it would mean his death and possibly his family's destruction. He couldn't undo what had been done to Emma Callahan, couldn't give her back her fingers or heal her bones or erase the trauma that would define the rest of her life. But he could do something, could provide information that might help her father find everyone responsible, could choose to be something other than the monster he'd been trained to become. He pulled his phone from his pocket and typed a message to a number he'd found through careful research, a number that connected to Agent Thomas Reeves's personal cell. I witnessed Emma Callahan's torture. I know everyone involved. I want immunity for my family and witness protection. I will testify against Black Ice, against Dr. Vance, against Judge Blackwood. This is Miguel Castillo. You have 48 hours to make a deal before I disappear. Dr. Helena Vance received the emergency call from Judge Blackwood at 3:15 a.m., his voice carrying panic that she'd never heard before. Miguel Castillo has contacted the FBI. He's offering to testify about Emma Callahan's torture. He knows you performed the procedures. He knows I gave the orders. We need to activate our evacuation protocols immediately. Helena felt her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse, years of planning and protection unraveling because a cartel enforcer had developed a conscience at the worst possible time. Can we eliminate him before he testifies? She asked, already knowing the answer. Blackwood's response confirmed her fears. FBI has him in protective custody already. Reeves moved faster than I anticipated. Our people in the Phoenix office can't get access to witness locations without triggering investigations. Then we eliminate the girl, Helena said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that allowed her to perform torture as easily as reconstructive surgery. Emma Callahan dies. Her father goes on a rampage that destroys evidence and discredits any investigation, and we use the chaos to disappear into our contingency identities. Blackwood was silent for a long moment, and Helena could almost hear him calculating probabilities and outcomes. The girl is in Phoenix Memorial, protected by hospital security and angels who are posted at every entrance. Getting to her would require a military-level assault that would draw attention we can't afford. We need a different solution. Then we eliminate the witnesses, Helena replied. Miguel, his family, Scott Williams, anyone who knows enough to testify. We have 48 hours to clean up loose ends before they're moved to secure federal facilities. After that, we activate evacuation protocols and disappear. I've been preparing for this contingency for 2 years, Raymond. Trust the plan. Blackwood agreed because he had no better options, and they spent the next hour coordinating a solution that would require eliminating at least 8 people in ways that appeared accidental or unrelated. What neither of them knew was that Tyler Ghost Park had been monitoring their communications for 36 hours through malware he'd installed in Blackwood's personal devices, and every word of their conversation was being recorded and streamed directly to Agent Reeves's secure servers. Catherine Callahan sat beside her daughter's hospital bed, watching Emma sleep through the pain medications that were the only mercy available in the immediate aftermath of her trauma. The surgeries had saved Emma's life, but couldn't restore what had been taken. The 3 fingers were gone forever. The femur would heal but never be as strong. The burn scars would fade but never disappear completely. Emma would live, but she would live as a permanently damaged version of herself. And Catherine understood that the psychological trauma of that reality might ultimately prove more destructive than the physical injuries. "I'm sorry, baby," Catherine whispered, knowing Emma couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. "I'm sorry we couldn't protect you. I'm sorry the world is full of people who would hurt a child to prove a point." Victor entered the hospital room at 4 a.m., his face showing the exhaustion of 72 hours without sleep, but his eyes carrying a clarity that suggested he'd made decisions that couldn't be unmade. "Catherine, we need to move Emma." Tyler intercepted communications between Judge Blackwood and Dr. Vance. They're planning to kill her within 48 hours to eliminate her as a witness. Agent Reeves is coordinating federal protection, but we can't trust that hospital security is enough when a federal judge is trying to cover up his crimes. Catherine wanted to argue that moving Emma in her condition was dangerous, that she needed medical care that only a hospital could provide. But she'd been married to Victor long enough to recognize when he was asking for permission versus informing her of decisions already made. "Where will you take her?" Catherine asked. Victor's response was immediate. "Somewhere protected by people who have more reason to keep her alive than Blackwood has to kill her. Somewhere with medical facilities and security that even a corrupt federal judge can't penetrate. Trust me, Catherine. I'm not letting anyone hurt our daughter again." He paused, then added something that made Catherine's breath catch. "And then I'm going to make sure the people who did this understand exactly what they took from her, in ways that will make them wish they'd never heard the name Emma Callahan." The safe house that Victor had arranged was actually a private medical facility 40 miles outside Phoenix, owned by a former Army medic turned Angels member who'd built a legitimate urgent care clinic that could handle everything from routine checkups to gunshot wounds without triggering mandatory reporting requirements. Emma was transferred at 5:30 a.m. in an ambulance staffed by Angels with EMT certifications, her sedation carefully maintained by Catherine, who temporarily abandoned her hospital position to stay with her daughter through whatever came next. Red Martinez coordinated security with 6 armed brothers positioned at every access point, motion sensors covering the perimeter, and Tyler monitoring all communications within a 3-mile radius for any suggestion that Blackwood had located their position. Agent Thomas Reeves arrived at the facility 2 hours after Emma's transfer, his presence representing the fragile bridge between legitimate law enforcement and the outlaw justice the angels were preparing to dispense. He carried with him Miguel Castillo's signed affidavit detailing every aspect of Emma's torture. Dr. Vance's surgical precision in removing fingers one at a time while Miguel held Emma down, Judge Blackwood's presence via video conference giving instructions about which procedures would create maximum psychological impact, the clinical discussions about pain tolerance and recovery timelines as if Emma were a laboratory subject rather than a human being. "This is enough to arrest both Vance and Blackwood," Reeves said, spreading the documents across the secure room's table. "Miguel's testimony combined with Tyler's intercepts of their communications gives us probable cause for immediate detention. But Victor, you need to understand something. These are powerful people with resources and connections. Even with this evidence, there's a significant chance they'll find ways to delay prosecution, to make deals, to receive sentences that don't match the magnitude of what they did to your daughter." Victor studied the affidavit with the careful attention of someone reading a technical manual, his face showing no emotion as he absorbed details about his daughter's torture that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When he finally looked up, his eyes carried a coldness that made even Reeves, a veteran of 30 years investigating violent criminals, feel a chill of apprehension. "Agent Reeves, I appreciate everything you've done to build this case. I appreciate Miguel's courage in coming forward, and I understand the limitations of the legal system. But you need to understand something in return. What happened to Emma wasn't just assault or kidnapping or even torture in the traditional sense. They transformed her. They turned a healthy 17-year-old girl with her entire life ahead of her into someone who will need assistance with basic tasks for the rest of her life, who will never play piano again because she's missing 3 fingers, who will walk with a permanent limp, who will carry burn scars that announce her victimization to everyone she meets. They didn't just hurt her, they rewrote her future, her identity, her fundamental relationship with her own body. The law can punish them, but it can't make them understand what they actually did. That requires something different." Red leaned forward, her Marine tactical experience evident in how she'd been processing the situation. "We've been tracking Scott's communications with his black ice handler. They're planning to move Tom Williams, Bishop's brother, within 24 hours to eliminate him as leverage now that Bishop has confessed. The transfer happens at a storage facility in Tempe that Black Ice uses for interrogations. Miguel has confirmed that Dr. Vance sometimes operates there when cartel members need medical attention they can't get at hospitals. If we hit that facility during the transfer, we get Tom, we get whoever Black Ice sends to move him, and we potentially get access to medical equipment and records that connect Vance to cartel operations." Reeves wanted to object, wanted to insist they coordinate with FBI tactical teams and execute the operation with proper law enforcement oversight. But he'd been in the Bureau long enough to recognize when the system's limitations made vigilante action the only practical option. If you recover Tom Williams alive and can document evidence of his imprisonment and torture, that strengthens the case against Black Ice and potentially against Vance if her equipment is there. But Victor, if anyone dies during this operation, if there's violence that can't be justified as self-defense, I can't protect you from criminal charges. I can look the other way on a lot of things, but I can't ignore bodies. "No one dies who doesn't need to die," Victor said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "But Agent Reeves, you need to prepare for the possibility that Dr. Vance and Judge Blackwood don't survive to trial. I'm not saying we'll kill them. I'm saying that people with their resources and their awareness that they're about to be arrested have a tendency to make desperate choices. Sometimes those choices end badly. Sometimes people who torture children discover that the universe has a way of delivering justice that courtrooms can't provide." The implicit threat was clear enough that Reeves should have walked away, should have arrested Victor for conspiracy to commit murder based on that statement alone. Instead, he gathered his documents and stood to leave, pausing at the door to deliver a final warning. "Whatever you're planning, make sure Emma can live with it." Make sure when your daughter looks at you 10 years from now, she sees a father who sought justice rather than a monster who became as bad as the people who hurt her. The Tempe storage facility raid happened at 11:47 p.m. with military precision that reflected Red's tactical planning and the Angels' accumulated experience in operations that required speed and overwhelming force. 23 Angels on motorcycles surrounded the facility while Tyler cut power and communications, plunging the building into darkness, broken only by the flashlights attached to weapons carried by people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Inside Unit 23D, they found Tom Williams chained to a chair, his body showing evidence of 3 months of systematic torture, broken fingers that had healed incorrectly, burned scars covering his torso, missing teeth and eyes that held the vacant 1,000-yard stare of someone whose mind had retreated from reality to survive. Scott Bishop Williams reached his brother first, his hands shaking as he unlocked the chains and caught Tom as he collapsed. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I'm so fucking sorry. I gave them Emma to save you. I betrayed the club, betrayed Victor, betrayed everything we stand for because I couldn't let them kill you. And they kept torturing you anyway." Tom's response was barely a whisper, his voice damaged from screaming and dehydration. "Not your fault, Scotty. They were never going to let me go. This was always about leverage, about making you do what they wanted. You couldn't save me. Nobody could save me. Just make it stop. Please make it stop." Red found what they'd come for in Unit 23E, a complete surgical suite with equipment that matched Dr. Vance's published specifications for battlefield trauma reconstruction, medical records showing 23 procedures performed on cartel members over 18 months, and most damningly, a detailed surgical log describing Emma Callahan's torture with clinical precision that included photographs documenting each stage of mutilation. The log was signed by Dr. Helena Vance and included notes about pain response, recovery projections, and psychological impact assessments that treated Emma like an experimental subject rather than a human being. "Tyler, copy everything," Red commanded. "Every file, every photograph, every piece of evidence that connects Vance to this facility. Agent Reeves gets the originals, but we keep copies as insurance." What they didn't find was Dr. Vance herself or any Black ICE members actively using the facility, suggesting that someone had warned them about the impending raid. Tyler discovered the answer when he accessed the facility's security system. A call had been made from Judge Blackwood's personal cell phone to a Black ICE number at 10:15 p.m., 75 minutes before the Angels arrived. Blackwood had burned his own operation to protect himself, warning the cartel that the storage facility was compromised and ensuring that anyone who might testify about his involvement wouldn't be captured alive. "He's cleaning house," Tyler said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Blackwood is eliminating everyone who knows too much. Miguel is in federal protective custody, so he can't get to him. But Vance is vulnerable. And if Blackwood is following the pattern we've seen in his other cases, he'll eliminate her within hours and make it look like cartel retaliation or suicide." Victor made his decision in the seconds it took to process Tyler's analysis, his voice carrying absolute authority when he spoke. "Red, get Tom to the medical facility where Emma is. Make sure Catherine sees him. She needs to document his injuries for Reeves's case. Tyler, find Dr. Vance's location now, every property she owns, every place she might run. And get me Judge Blackwood's current position. We're not letting either of them disappear into federal protection or get killed by cartel cleanup crews. They're going to face what they did to Emma, and they're going to understand exactly what that means." Dr. Helena Vance sat in her home office at 1:30 a.m. reviewing offshore account balances and passport documentation that represented 2 years of careful planning for exactly this contingency. Judge Blackwood had called 30 minutes ago with instructions to evacuate immediately, to use the private plane she kept fueled at Scottsdale Airport, to disappear into the identity networks they'd established in countries without extradition treaties. But Helena was calculating a different equation. Blackwood had compromised the storage facility, had warned Black Ice about the Angel's raid, which meant he viewed Helena as expendable. If she ran, she'd be running from both law enforcement and cartel cleanup crews sent to eliminate witnesses. Her best option wasn't evacuation, but negotiation, offering Agent Reeves everything she knew about Blackwood's corruption in exchange for witness protection and reduced charges. She was drafting an email to Reeves when her home security system alerted her to motion on the perimeter, multiple contacts approaching from different directions with the coordinated movement that suggested tactical training. Helena pulled her weapon from her desk drawer, a 9mm Glock she'd purchased for personal protection but had never fired outside a range, and moved toward her panic room, the reinforced safe space she'd installed specifically for scenarios like this. She'd taken 3 steps when the power cut out, plunging her house into darkness, and Helena understood with crystalline clarity that whoever was outside had planned for every contingency, including her panic room. She heard glass breaking, doors being forced, multiple entry points being breached simultaneously, and then read Martinez's voice calling out with military authority, "Dr. Vance, we know you're here. We're not here to kill you. We're here to bring you to someone who deserves to look you in the eye." Helena considered shooting, considered forcing them to kill her rather than face whatever the Angels had planned, but 30 years of survival instinct overrode momentary courage. She dropped her weapon and raised her hands, her voice steady despite terror consuming her. "I'm unarmed. I'm surrendering. I want Agent Reeves contacted immediately. I have information about Judge Blackwood that the FBI needs. I'm willing to cooperate fully in exchange for protection." Red emerged from the darkness with a flashlight, her weathered face showing no sympathy as she secured Helena's wrists with zip ties. "You'll get your chance to talk to Reeves. But first, you're going to meet Emma Callahan. You're going to see what you did to her. You're going to look at a 17-year-old girl missing 3 fingers and understand that your surgical expertise, your medical training, your oath to do no harm, you weaponized all of it to torture a child for political strategy." The drive to the medical facility took 43 minutes. Helena seated in the back of an SUV between 2 Angels who didn't speak or respond to her attempts at conversation. When they arrived, she was escorted into a room where Emma Callahan lay in a hospital bed, her left hand wrapped in bandages that couldn't hide the missing fingers, her right leg elevated in a cast, burn dressings covering her torso. Catherine Callahan stood beside her daughter's bed, and when she saw Helena, the ER physician's professional composure shattered completely. "You did this," Catherine said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "You're a doctor. You took an oath to heal people, and you used your training to systematically mutilate my daughter. Why? What could possibly justify what you did to her?" Helena wanted to explain about political strategy, about the necessity of sending messages that controlled behavior, about how Emma's torture was meant to prevent larger violence by demonstrating the consequences of club operations. But looking at Emma's bandaged hand, at the teenager's pale face, still showing traces of trauma even in sedated sleep, Helena couldn't find words that made her actions defensible even to herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology inadequate, but all she had. "I convinced myself that this was necessary, that hurting one person could prevent a war that would hurt hundreds. I told myself that I was being strategic, that the means justified the ends. I was wrong. I became a monster while telling myself I was being practical." Victor entered the room with Agent Reeves behind him, the FBI agent's presence representing whatever fragile constraint might prevent the violence that everyone could feel building. "Dr. Vance," Victor said quietly, his voice carrying none of the rage Helena had expected but something colder and more permanent. "You took my daughter's future. You removed her fingers, broke her bones, burned her skin, all with surgical precision designed to maximize permanent damage while keeping her alive. The question I've been asking myself for 4 days is what punishment could possibly be equivalent to what you did? Death is too easy, too final. Prison is too impersonal. I needed something that would make you understand what you actually did to Emma. He gestured to Catherine, who'd been preparing something during Victor's speech. You're a plastic surgeon, Dr. Vance. One of the best in Phoenix. Your hands are your career, your identity, your entire professional life. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to cooperate fully with Agent Reeves's investigation. You're going to testify against Judge Blackwood and provide every piece of evidence about his corruption. You're going to plead guilty to every charge related to Emma's torture without seeking any deals or reduced sentences. And then, you're going to prison for the rest of your life, where every day you'll have your hands and your medical knowledge but no ability to use them, where you'll watch yourself age knowing that the skills you once had are deteriorating unused, where you'll understand what it means to be permanently separated from your identity and purpose. That's the price, Dr. Vance. Not death, not quick vengeance, but living every day with the understanding that you destroyed yourself along with my daughter. Helena felt something break inside her, the realization that Victor had designed a punishment that was somehow worse than anything she'd imagined. She would live, but she would live as a shell of herself, her medical career destroyed, her hands useless, her expertise wasted. It was a psychological torture as calculated as anything she'd done to Emma, and the symmetry of it was horrifying. I'll cooperate, she said, her voice barely audible. I'll testify. I'll plead guilty. Just keep me away from black ice retaliation. Keep me alive long enough to face what I've done. Judge Raymond Blackwood was arrested at 3:47 a.m. by FBI agents acting on emergency authorization from the Attorney General, his home surrounded by federal tactical teams that prevented any possibility of escape or resistance. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Tyler's intercepts of his communications with Dr. Vance, Miguel's testimony about Blackwood's orders regarding Emma's torture, financial records showing $43 million in payments from Black Ice over 3 years, and most damningly, Dr. Vance's complete cooperation, including detailed descriptions of meetings where Blackwood had outlined his strategy for using cartel violence to eliminate targets while maintaining judicial immunity. What Blackwood hadn't anticipated was that his corruption had made him as vulnerable to cartel retaliation as to law enforcement prosecution. Black Ice leadership, recognizing that Blackwood's arrest exposed their entire Arizona operation, had already issued elimination orders for the judge before federal agents could secure him. The assassination attempt came during transport to federal detention, a coordinated ambush involving 10 cartel sicarios who'd tracked the transport route through corrupt officials still operating in Phoenix PD. The FBI tactical team assigned to Blackwood's protection fought back with professional efficiency, but in the chaos of the firefight, a stray round hit Blackwood in the chest, the .308 bullet punching through his judicial robes, which he'd insisted on wearing even in custody, and into his heart. Raymond Blackwood, federal judge and architect of Emma Callahan's torture, died in the street while handcuffed and wearing the symbols of justice he'd perverted for profit. Agent Reeves ruled the death an unfortunate casualty of cartel retaliation, and while Victor suspected that the stray round might have been more carefully aimed than official reports suggested, he accepted the outcome as justice enough. Blackwood was dead. Dr. Vance was facing 9 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole, and Black Ice Cartel's Arizona operations were collapsing as federal prosecutors used Miguel's testimony and the storage facility evidence to arrest 73 members across 3 states. The price had been paid, though not in the dramatic blood-soaked revenge that cartel culture or outlaw mythology might have demanded. The price was surgical precision. Blackwood dead, Vance imprisoned forever, Emma alive but permanently changed, and Victor forced to live with the knowledge that he'd avenged his daughter but couldn't restore what she'd lost. 6 months after Emma's torture, Catherine Callahan sat in a courtroom watching Dr. Helena Vance receive her sentence, 850 years across multiple charges, the numbers so absurd they became almost meaningless except as confirmation that Vance would die in prison. Emma sat beside her mother in the gallery, her left hand resting on Catherine's arm, showing the prosthetic fingers that advanced technology could provide, but that would never fully replace what she'd lost. The 17-year-old, now 18 and preparing to start college, had chosen to attend the sentencing because her therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, believed that witnessing Vance's punishment might provide closure. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked quietly as the bailiff led Vance away in chains. Emma was silent for a long moment before responding. "I feel like she got what she deserved. But I also feel like it doesn't change anything that happened to me. She'll be in prison forever, but I'll still be missing 3 fingers. I'll still walk with a limp. I'll still have nightmares about surgical instruments and people who smile while they hurt you. Justice happened, Mom, but it didn't heal me." Victor attended the sentencing from the back row, no longer wearing his Hells Angels cut, having stepped down as chapter president 3 months ago to focus on supporting Emma's recovery and rebuilding his relationship with Catherine. They weren't getting back together romantically. Too much had happened, too many years had passed. But they'd found a partnership in parenting their traumatized daughter that worked better than their marriage ever had. After the sentencing, Victor met with Agent Reeves for what both men knew would be their final conversation. The investigation completed, and their uncomfortable alliance no longer necessary. "Thank you for trusting me," Reeves said, extending his hand. "For giving me the evidence to make this case, for not killing Vance even though you could have, for letting the system work even when it worked imperfectly." "The system didn't work," Victor replied, his voice carrying neither anger nor accusation but simple statement of fact. "The system failed to protect Emma. The system employed a corrupt judge who orchestrated her torture. The system would have let Vance escape if we hadn't caught her. What worked was people making choices outside the system. Miguel risking his life to testify, Tyler hacking communications illegally, Red executing a raid that had no law enforcement authorization, me choosing to let Vance live when every instinct screamed to make her suffer like she made Emma suffer. That's not the system working, Agent Reeves. That's individual people choosing to be better than the institutions they serve." Reeves couldn't argue with that assessment, had spent 30 years watching the justice system fail victims while protecting perpetrators who had resources and connections. He'd retired 2 weeks ago with full pension and had immediately started consulting for a nonprofit that helped crime victims navigate the legal system, his attempt to do more good outside the bureau than he'd been able to do inside it. "What will you do now?" Reeves asked. Victor smiled without humor. "I'm going to be Emma's father. I'm going to help her learn to play piano with prosthetic fingers. I'm going to walk her down the aisle when she gets married someday. I'm going to be there when she has children and help her understand that the violence that marked her life doesn't have to define her future. I'm going to be better than the man I was, because that's what Emma deserves." 3 years after her torture, Emma Callahan graduated from Arizona State University with honors in psychology. Her thesis focused on recovery from torture trauma and the psychological impacts of medical violence. She'd become an advocate for victims' rights, testifying before state legislators about the inadequacy of victim compensation programs and the need for better mental health support for families of crime victims. Her prosthetic fingers worked well enough that she could type and text and perform most daily tasks, though she'd abandoned piano for guitar, learning to play despite her physical limitations. The limp had improved through years of physical therapy to the point where most people wouldn't notice unless they watched carefully. The burn scars had faded through reconstructive surgeries, though she still wore long sleeves most days, still felt self-conscious about the marks that announced her victimization. On what would have been Dr. Vance's 51st birthday, Emma visited the Supermax prison where the former surgeon was serving her sentence and requested a meeting that prison officials approved after consultation with Emma's therapist. The two women sat across from each other in a visitation room, separated by reinforced glass, connected by phones that carried their voices with tinny artificiality. "Why did you come here?" Vance asked, her hair now gray, her hands showing the beginning of arthritis that would eventually destroy the fine motor control she'd once possessed. Emma studied the woman who'd tortured her with surgical precision and felt something unexpected, Not forgiveness, but a recognition of shared humanity that coexisted with acknowledgement of monstrous choices. I came to tell you that you didn't break me. You hurt me, you changed my body, you gave me trauma that I'll carry forever. But I'm graduating college, I'm helping other victims, I'm building a life that matters. You tried to destroy me to prove a strategic point, and you failed. I want you to spend the rest of your life in this prison knowing that Emma Callahan survived, grew, thrived despite everything you did to prevent that. Vance's face showed something that might have been genuine remorse or might have been despair at her own circumstances, impossible to distinguish. I'm glad you survived, she said quietly. I'm glad you're building a life. If it matters at all, I think about what I did to you every single day. The official punishment is 850 years, but the real punishment is living with the memory of your face when I was cutting off your fingers, hearing you begging for your father, knowing that I could have chosen differently at any moment and didn't. I was a doctor, Emma. I was supposed to heal people. Instead, I used my training to torture a child. I'll die in this prison, but I died the day I made that choice. The person I was, the surgeon, the healer, the woman who believed she was doing important work, she's gone. What's left is just a shell serving time. Emma ended the visit after 23 minutes, having said what she came to say and heard what she needed to hear. As she walked out of the prison, she called her father to let him know she was okay, that the visit had been the right choice, that she was ready to move forward with her life without carrying Vance's ghost anymore. Victor met her in the parking lot, having driven 3 hours to be there in case his daughter needed him, and together they rode back to Phoenix on his motorcycle. Emma's arms around her father, the wind in her hair, the road stretching ahead of them like possibility. Their story serves as a reminder that the worst punishments aren't always death or physical suffering, but living with the permanent consequences of choices that can never be unmade. It's a reminder that justice is rarely clean or satisfying, that surviving trauma doesn't mean being unchanged by it, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to build a life from the wreckage of what was taken from us. Dr. Helena Vance will die in prison, having never practiced medicine again. Judge Raymond Blackwood died in the street wearing the robes of justice he'd perverted. Emma Callahan lives with 3 prosthetic fingers and a limp and burn scars, but she also lives with purpose, with advocacy, with the determination to ensure that what happened to her creates meaning rather than just suffering. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring the complex nature of justice, revenge, and recovery. Share this with someone who needs to understand that surviving isn't the same as being unscathed, that the price perpetrators pay can be measured in ways beyond violence, and that sometimes the most powerful response to having your future stolen is building a new one from the pieces that remain. Emma Callahan's torture was an attempt to break her father by breaking her. Instead, it revealed that the strongest revenge isn't matching cruelty with cruelty, but becoming someone who transforms suffering into purpose and refuses to let violence have the final word.